We're going to go ahead and get started this morning. This morning we're discussing faith when it seems impossible. Faith when it seems impossible. Emily Dickinson was an American poet. She wrote nearly 1,800 poems. Most of them were published after her death. Most of them were untitled, and they're simply given the title from the first line of the poem. You're probably familiar with some of these poems. I want to refer to just a couple of them. One is Hope is a Thing with Feathers. You likely know that poem. That's one of her most famous ones. It says, Hope is a thing with feathers and perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. What a great poem that is, picturing hope as a bird that perches in our souls, that warms us in the coldest nights, that cheers us in the darkest times, and obviously calms us in the greatest storms. And in return, it doesn't ask for anything. It gives and gives and gives, but asks nothing of us. Another poem for which she is known is the poem I Dwell in Possibility. You may remember that poem. You may remember that in that poem, she's contrasting poetry and prose. And she is esteeming the virtues of poetry over prose. And she suggests that there are two houses and that poetry is a better house. And poetry is a better house because it offers greater possibilities. It offers greater imagination on the part of those that read the poem. It has more windows. It has greater doors. It has a higher ceiling than what prose does. And I think we would probably agree with her. We understand why she would argue that, because she is a poet. Of course, she's going to think it's the best. But we as Christians, we dwell in possibility. We dwell in a house that has more windows, that has better doors, that has a higher ceiling than other people dwell in. We dwell in possibility because of the God that we serve. In Matthew chapter 17 and verse 20, you remember that Jesus is dealing with the disciples at a time when they're rather discouraged. They have gone out and there is one who has come to them who has a demon, and they have attempted to cast out that demon and they have been unsuccessful. And so he has come to Jesus in order to get the demon removed. And Jesus cast out the demon, and the disciples privately asked the Lord, why couldn't we do that? What did we do wrong? What was wrong with what we attempted to do? And Jesus says, it was because of your unbelief. If you had faith just the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it would move. Nothing would be impossible for you. But Jesus said this kind of demon only comes out with fasting and prayer. And their faith had not been great enough to cast it out. In Matthew chapter 21, in verses 21 and 22, we have another occasion where Jesus refers to the same thing or same situation. On this occasion, Jesus has cursed a fig tree, and it has withered very quickly. And so the disciples are amazed by how quickly it died. They knew it takes time for things to die, just like it takes time for things to grow. And they were amazed at how quickly this tree died. And so they said something to the Lord about it. And the Lord said, if you had faith, you would be able to say to this mountain and cast it into the sea, and it would happen. Jesus says, because with prayer and faith, nothing will be impossible for you. So we dwell in possibility because we have faith, and faith makes things possible. Faith is the way that John says we overcome the world. It is the victory as we sing. Faith is such a powerful thing. Faith is a powerful thing because faith connects us with an all-powerful God. God has all power. Jeremiah 32 and verse 17, Jeremiah is praying to God, and he says, Lord God, Thou who hast made the heavens and the earth with your great power and outstretched arm. And there's nothing too hard for you. Nothing too hard for God. Job chapter 42 and verse 2, Job says, I know that you can do all things. Our God can do everything. Nothing is too hard for Him. But the amazing thing about our God is our God doesn't just do them for us, but rather our God gives us the power to do them. He gives us the strength to do them. Philippians 4:13, we love that passage. Paul says, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. You see, Christ gives us the power to do all things. He doesn't just do those things for us, but He gives us the strength to be able to do them. That's the beauty of that passage, is He lets us do great things through the power that He gives to us. Isaiah 40 and verse 31, Isaiah says, those that wait upon the Lord, they shall renew their strength. They shall mount up on high with wings as eagles. They shall run and not faint. They shall walk and they shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And so we think in that passage, we wait on the Lord and the Lord renews our strength. He doesn't just do it for us. He doesn't say, well, you're tired, you're weary, let me do it. No, God says, I'll give you strength. I'll renew your strength. I'll give you the ability to fly like an eagle, to run and not be weary, and to walk and not faint. So God gives us the power. He gives us the strength to do those things. Now, what I want to spend the time in this lesson doing is showing you some impossible situations in the Bible. Some impossible situations from a human viewpoint that were made possible because of the God that they served and because of the God that they believed in. We're going to begin in Hebrews chapter 11. That is the faith chapter of the Bible. That's Faith Hall of Fame. We won't stay solely in that chapter. We'll go some other places, but we want to begin there. There are a lot of examples of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, and we can notice any one of them because they all face somewhat impossible situations. That's why they're here, because their faith was great enough to overcome the greatest challenges. But we're going to notice just a few of the highlights from this chapter. We want to begin with Abraham. He is the father of the faithful. And the first thing I want to begin, the first situation I want to bring up as an impossible situation was when Abraham and Sarah needed to have a child. They needed to have a son. God had made promises, Genesis chapter 12. He had made promises that Abraham's seed was going to be like the stars of heaven and the sand of the seashore and the dust of the earth. You're not going to be able to count them, not going to be able to number them. When God made that promise, Abraham was 75, Sarah was 65. And in 10 years, after they had been in the land, they left their home and they had been in the land that God had told them to go to, they haven't had a child yet. Sarah's been barren her whole life, and Abraham's getting older by the day, and there's no child that's come. And God has told Abraham, it's going to come from your loins. It's going to come from you, this child that's going to be born. Because Abraham was thinking, Eliezer, my servant, he's going to have to be my heir. And God says, no, it's not going to be Eliezer. It's going to be someone that comes from you. And so that hatches evidently the mind of Sarah. And Sarah says, here's my handmaid Hagar. Go into her, bring seed through her. It'll be you through her. She's my handmaiden, she belongs to me, this is the way we'll do it. And Abraham does that, and then Abraham is informed, no, it's not going to be Ishmael. It's going to be Isaac. His name's going to be Isaac. And a year from now, Sarah's going to give birth to this son. Now, at the time, Abraham, that time that Isaac's born, Abraham is 100, and Sarah is 90. Sarah's been barren her whole life, never been able to have children. Abraham has reached the point to where he no longer can produce a child. And so God delights in the impossible. God waits until things are impossible from a human standpoint so that He can give them the power to do this, so that it will show how powerful and how great He is. I want you to go to Genesis chapter 18. I want you to notice the passage with me. This is when Abraham is informed that he's going to have this son. And Sarah was listening in the tent door as Abraham's being informed of this. I want you to begin in verse 10. It says, and he said in Genesis 18, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure? My Lord being old also. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for God? What did Jeremiah say? Nothing is too hard for you. Nothing too hard for God. This wasn't too hard for God. They were going to have this son just as God promised it. You remember that Romans chapter 4 is going to talk about Abraham's faith, how that he was not weak in faith, how that he against hope believed in hope, how that he had strong consolation, strong faith, that God speaks of things that do not exist as if they did exist. We serve a God with whom things are possible. That's the first impossible situation that became possible because of the God that they served. But let's think about another impossible situation, this one also involving Abraham. Think about Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 17 through 19. This is when God has commanded Abraham to offer his son Isaac on the altar. And Abraham has had promises given to him through this son. And so Abraham is thinking in his mind, God made promises through this son. If I kill this son, how is God going to keep his promises? And so Abraham reasoned it out. He accounted it within his mind that God was going to raise this son from the dead. Now, that's amazing in and of itself when we talk about a resurrection from the dead. But it's more amazing because at this time in history, no one had ever been raised from the dead. And so Abraham believes that God's going to do something that he's never done before. And he's willing to take the life of his son, believing that God has the power to bring him back to life, even though God has never brought anybody back to life. That's the kind of faith that he had. This is an impossible situation. I'm offering the son that God made promises through. And yet, we find that it's going to happen because God's going to work it out. It's an impossible situation that's made possible because of the God that we serve. But continue in Hebrews chapter 11. Let's notice some other examples from this chapter. The next one that comes to mind are the parents of Moses. Verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's commands. That's Exodus 1, Exodus 2 if you want to read the background of this. Amram and Jochebed are slaves in Egypt. And they're slaves in Egypt at a very difficult time because Pharaoh has become concerned with the Israelites multiplying. And he's afraid that they're going to grow to such an extent that they might rebel or they might be joined with another nation and rebel, and he would lose his position in his nation. And so he says, we got to do something about this. So we're going to make their work harder. We're going to take away the straw. We're going to make things as difficult as we can. That'll eliminate some of them. But beyond that, we're going to kill all the male babies to make sure they don't produce any more soldiers, any more people capable of rebelling against us. And so he gives this command to the Hebrew midwives that they kill any male children that are born. Moses' parents are not going to turn their son away. They're not going to give him up that easily. And so they hide him, the Bible says, for 3 months. It's pretty hard to hide a baby. You ever thought about that? Babies, they aren't naturally quiet. They let their needs be known by making sounds, by making noise, by crying. Well, that's a giveaway if you're slaves in a foreign land and a baby starts crying. But not only that, Amram and Jochebed must have lived in slaves' quarters. They don't tend to be roomy. They don't tend to be full of furniture. They don't tend to be full of hiding places. No, they're just bare rooms. How did they hide this baby for 3 months? But they did. Why? Because this seems impossible that they could save this baby's life. But you remember the plan that they had? We're going to make an ark of bulrushes. We're going to make it waterproof. We're going to put this baby in this basket. We're going to put him where Pharaoh's daughter would discover him. And the very one that was threatening his life is going to be the one that's going to protect his life because he's going to become the son of Pharaoh's daughter. An impossible situation that becomes possible because of the faith that they possessed, the faith that they had. But I want you to think about other situations in Hebrews chapter 11. If you'll notice the context with me. The next thing we read about is verse 29. By faith they passed through the Red Sea. You remember Moses leads them out of Egypt. He leads them all the way to the Red Sea. And Pharaoh changes his mind. He comes after them. And so Pharaoh is pressing down on them. They're trapped by the sea. The sea's in their way. They can't go any further. Pharaoh has encircled them from the other side. so they're going to perish. And they begin to cry out to Moses, were there not enough graves in Egypt? You mean to tell us we couldn't have just died and been buried in Egypt? We got to come all the way out here to be killed? Come all the way out here and be buried in the sand of the wilderness? Really, Moses? What were you thinking? And you remember that God is going to part the Red Sea. And they're going to cross on dry ground. Pharaoh, trying to follow them, is going to perish in the sea. A seemingly impossible situation that's made possible because of the God that they serve. But continue in the chapter. Look at verse 30. We read about the walls of Jericho. You remember Joshua? You remember Joshua and Caleb, the faithful spies? And you remember Joshua's taking the place of Moses, once Moses has not been allowed to enter into the promised land. And so Joshua's going to come into the city of Jericho. The first thing they come up against in the land of promise is a walled city. A wall. They come right up against a wall. And God says, here's the way I want you to take that city. I want you to march around that city for 7 days. The seventh day I want you to march around it, and I want you to shout and blow the trumpet, and the walls are just going to fall down. Impossible. Impossible that you can overcome a city like this without firing a shot, without doing anything, but just simply marching around it and shouting and blowing trumpets on the final day. How is that going to happen? It's impossible. But it happens because they believe in the God who makes all things possible. But notice as we continue. Look at verse 32. We read about Gideon. You remember Gideon's story? You remember what the Bible has to say about Gideon, this great man of God? You remember Gideon and how that Gideon was facing the Midianites. In fact, we're not given the exact numbers of the Midianites. We're simply told that they were like grasshoppers in number. There were so many of them, they just covered the hills around Gideon and around his people. And you remember that Gideon had a pretty good army. He had 32,000. We assume that's not enough. That doesn't match up against the grasshoppers of Midian. But nonetheless, 32,000 is a pretty good sized army. God says, Gideon's too many. Too many? What do you mean? Too many. You tell the ones that are fearful and afraid to go home, and 10,000 of them went home. 10,000 cowards walked out immediately. Well, his troops are greatly diminished. God said, you know what, Gideon's still too many. What do you mean it's too many? Well, I want another test. You go down the water and you have them drink from the river, and you see which ones lap water like a dog and which ones don't do that, and you send those home. And so he gets down to 300. 300 against all the grasshoppers of Midian. Gideon must have thought, God, that's impossible. God, that's impossible. And God says, not only that, I want you to take a pitcher, I want you to take a lamp, and I want you to put that lamp underneath that pitcher. I want you to spread your men out, and then at a certain time I want you to blow a trumpet, and I want you to break the pitcher and show those lights. And God says, you're going to defeat the Midianites. That's impossible, God. But you know what? The Midianites defeated themselves. They were so scared and so afraid by the lights that they saw in the mountains around them that they began to fight and attack and kill one another. It was impossible, but it was made possible by God with whom all things are possible. Then we read about David in verse 32. David and Goliath. Well, that seemed impossible, right? This shepherd boy going up against this giant, this champion of Philistia. This one who had gone into battle many times and always come out of battle, always defeated everybody he'd ever come up against. And now this small boy, this shepherd, is going to go up against him. Now Israel had their own giant. They had Saul who stood head and shoulders above the rest, but Saul wasn't willing to meet him. But this young man was going to meet him. Well, David's brothers didn't think he was capable of meeting Goliath. They even made fun of him. Who did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness with? David, you're a shepherd. You're not a soldier. David, we know you just came down here to see the battle. You didn't come down here to fight. You came down here to watch. Then Saul said, David, this is a man of war, and you're just a young man. You're just a youth. He's been a soldier longer than you've been alive. David, you're not able to go up against this man. Goliath didn't think he was able. Goliath began to make fun of him. Did your dog come out to bark at me? You're just a little chihuahua coming out here to take me on. What do you think, David? It's impossible. But then it's Goliath that's stretched out on the ground. It's Goliath that's been slain. It's Goliath who has his head cut off and paraded, not David. Why? Impossible, but possible because of the God that we serve. Let's go beyond Hebrews chapter 11 and notice some other examples. What about Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 and 2? You remember that things were so bad within the city that they had turned to cannibalism. Mothers had agreed to eat their children, one day mine, the next day yours. And there's conflict about that, of course. And you remember that they were selling the head of a donkey for an exorbitant price. You remember dove's dung was being sold. Something that wasn't even food was being sold at an extremely high price. That's how short of food they were in the city. But then Elisha said, tomorrow prices are going to drop. Tomorrow prices are going to be cheap for all of these things. And they said, one of the servants of the king said, if the windows of heaven opened, that wouldn't be possible. And Elisha said, it will be possible, but you won't be here to see it. You're not going to live long enough to enjoy it. In fact, when the news came of all the food that was available, they trampled that servant to death. He never got to enjoy it. What seemed impossible became possible because 4 lepers were going out to the enemy to try to find food because they didn't have anything. So they're making their way out. And God made those 4 lepers sound like a great army. And so the enemy ran away scared. They left their tents, left all their food, and Israel was able to take it and benefit from it. And so that's an impossible situation that God made possible. What about Isaiah 37? We read about Sennacherib. Sennacherib came up against Hezekiah. And he has, there's archaeological tablets that we've found where Sennacherib is boasting. He's king of Assyria, king of the most powerful people on earth at the time. And he's boasting about how he has Hezekiah shut up in a cage like a bird. I've surrounded his city. He's like a bird in a cage. I'm fixing to go get him. And you remember what God said? God had said, Hezekiah, because you prayed, because you had faith, he won't shoot an arrow there. There won't be an arrow that will go across the wall into the city. The Bible says that an angel went out from God and killed 185,000 before they could fire a shot. The king runs home and then he's slain as he's in his house of idolatry worshiping by 2 of his sons. Impossible situation that was made possible by the God that they believed in. What about Nehemiah? You remember Nehemiah? He was sent back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. If you read that book, you see what an impossible job that was. He goes back to the city. Everything's in ruin. It's been broken down. It's been burned. He can't even ride on horseback. He has to get off and walk because the destruction is so bad. But in 52 days, Nehemiah 6:15, he's going to rebuild the walls of this city with a big group of people that weren't construction workers. They were from all common walks of life, men, women, and children. And he's going to rebuild these walls in record time. How's he going to do that? He says the good hand of our God is going to help us. That's how we're going to do it. It's impossible, but our God will make it possible. What about Jesus in Luke 24 and verse 44? Jesus talks about all that was written of him in the law and in the prophets and in the Psalms and how he fulfilled all of those things. It seems impossible that Jesus could have fulfilled all of those prophecies in the Old Testament. You know, there are over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that are just centered in on Jesus and his kingdom. He fulfilled every one of them. Didn't miss on any of them. Didn't get just close on some of them. No, he fulfilled every one of them. And they're very specific prophecies. Like he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Not like the Book of Mormon says, born in Jerusalem. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. It specified the little place where he's going to be born. It specified the price of betrayal, 30 pieces of silver, Zechariah 11. 12 and 13. It predicted the manner of his death and crucifixion. It predicted even the words that he would say on the cross and that would be said about him on the cross in Psalm 22. Very specific prophecies. Peter Stoner was a mathematician. He dealt with probability, and he figured the probability that just 6 of these prophecies could have been fulfilled by chance. And he came up with a number of 1 in 10 to the 17th power as far as the possibility or probability of this occurring. And this is the way he illustrated that number. If you take a state the size of Texas, which, by the way, Texas is big. You take a state the size of Texas, you cover it with silver dollars until they're 2 feet deep. You blindfold a man, you mark one of those silver dollars somewhere in the state of Texas, you let him go and pick one coin. What's the chance he's going to get the coin that you marked? Not very good chance, right? That's impossible. But we're not talking about 6 or 8 of these prophecies. We're talking about every one of them being fulfilled in Jesus Christ. How's that possible? Seems impossible, but not with the God that we serve. He makes everything possible. Think about some other examples of this. What about the feeding of the 5,000, Matthew chapter 14, verses 17 through 21? You remember 5 loaves, 2 fish, and the people are so great in number. There are 5,000 men, Matthew says. That's not counting women and children. Now, if there are 5,000 men, I know there are at least as many women and children as there are men. You look in this audience and see there's more women and children than there are men. That's just common. That's just natural for it to be that way. And so if there's 5,000 men, we're talking at least 15,000, maybe 20,000 people represented here. 5 loaves and 2 fish. How are you going to feed all of them? How are you going to have 12 baskets of fragments to take up after you're over and done with? How are you going to do that? That's impossible. Not with God. With God, that's possible. What about Peter? What about Peter walking on the water? You know how the Egyptians pictured impossibility? They pictured it as walking on the water. That's how they pictured impossibility. The Jews pictured impossibility as moving a mountain. That's why Jesus said what he did in Matthew 17:20 and 21:21. Because moving a mountain in the Jewish language was impossible. That's how you picture the impossible. Jesus said you can do the impossible if you have faith in God. And Peter did the impossible by walking on the water. He said, well, he didn't walk very far. He walked further than I ever have, or than I ever will, or you ever have, or you ever will. The only other man who can say that he walked on water, only other man who knows what that feels like. I don't care if he took 1 step. It's impressive. It's amazing that he was able to do that. And he was able to do that. What is impossible, he was able to do it through the power of the Lord. What about this one? This is one of my favorite ones. In Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27, we read about Peter casting a hook into the sea. They came to Peter and they set Peter up, and Peter fell for it. They came to Peter and they said, Peter, doesn't your teacher pay taxes? How would you answer that? Probably the same way Peter would have. He said, of course my teacher pays taxes. My teacher taught us to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's. Of course he pays taxes. And when he went inside the house, Jesus said, Peter, let me ask you a question. Kings collect taxes. Do they collect taxes of their own sons or strangers? Lord, they collect the taxes of strangers. That's right, Peter. But guess what you just volunteered me to do? Pay a tax. I'm the Son of God. You said I'm going to pay the tax. But we don't want to offend them. We don't want a problem. So, Peter, we need to pay the tax. So, Peter, I want you to go cast a hook into the sea, and I want you to catch a fish, and I want you to, when you get that fish, the first fish that you catch, I want you to open up his mouth. Inside his mouth is going to be a coin, and we're going to take that coin and we're going to pay our taxes. You ever thought about that? I like superheroes growing up, and there's a lot of good ones, but my favorite was Aquaman. Maybe not yours, but mine. I love to fish, and so the idea that you could call the fish and get as many as you want and get them to come to you, that was right down what I wanted growing up. If I could have done that, I would have been as happy as anybody on earth to be able to call all the fish to where I was fishing. Well, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, you're going to cast a hook, 1 line into the sea. You're going to catch the first fish you catch is going to have this coin in its mouth. You ever thought about the logistics of all of that? That's impossible. How many fish are there in the sea? And you're going to catch the one with the coin in his mouth? Did God tell that fish, or Jesus tell that fish? There's a ship that sank. It was full of treasure. You go out to that sunken ship. You go down into that ship. You find where that treasure box is, and you pick up just this coin, not any of the others, just this coin, and you swim back, and you wait till you see a hook come into the water, and you bite that hook, and you let him pull you in. Now, don't drop the coin. Don't lose the coin on your way in. And Peter gets that fish, gets that coin, pays the tax. That's impossible. But not with God. It's possible because of the God that we serve. What about this one? Jesus said to the apostles in giving the Great Commission, I want you to go into all the world. I want you to teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Matthew 28:18-20. How are 12 men going to possibly take the gospel to the whole world? How are they going to do that? That is impossible. But Colossians 1:23 says that the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven, whereof Paul was made a minister. Paul says it got done. How did it get done? How was that possible? It was possible because of the God that they served. Because with God, all things are possible. Now, with me and with you, things are not always possible. But with God, they are always possible. I want to suggest to you that just from these 15 examples that I've given you from the Bible, that we should never question whether or not we can do something if we have faith in the living God. Now, He may not give us the power to do it because He may not want it done, but He has the power to do it. Now, I'm not suggesting this afternoon that you go out and you get down on your knees and you pray for a mountain to move. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't want you to get up discouraged thinking, well, I don't have enough faith. And I don't want you to get up discouraged thinking, well, God's not powerful enough. He is powerful enough, and your faith can move that mountain. Because your faith can do hard, difficult things with the help of God. Matthew 19:26, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and He says, with men, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. He's talking in a situation, Matthew 19, of course, we know deals with marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And we know that it also deals with the rich young ruler who came to Jesus, said, good master, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life? Jesus tells him, and He says, all these commandments I've kept from my youth up. What do I lack? What am I missing? And Jesus said, you go and you sell everything that you have and you give to the poor, and then you come and follow me. And this young man, this rich young ruler, went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And Jesus explained to the disciples, it's hard for a rich man to go to heaven. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven. Now, their humor worked differently than our humor. Jesus had a sense of humor, and we see that in the Gospels. We see, you're trying to get the piece of sawdust out of your brother's eye when you got this big 2x4 sticking out of your eye. That's not our kind of humor, but it was their kind of humor. Their humor works by exaggeration. I go to countries now as a missionary, and their humor is not based on a punchline like ours is. It's based on exaggeration. The greater you can exaggerate something, the funnier it'll be to them. And that was in Jesus' day. That's how they looked at this. And so Jesus says, here's a camel with all those humps, going through this eye of a needle. That's hilarious as they think about it. It's impossible. It's not going to happen. Jesus says, it's hard for a rich man to go to heaven because a rich man tends to trust on his riches and not in God. It's difficult for that man to realize that he needs God. It's difficult for that man to realize how he has to obey God and submit to God. The story is told by Brother Gus Nichols, and he was preaching a meeting somewhere, and the brethren wanted to show him a good time while he was there for the meeting. And so they were driving him around town and showing him the town. And they drove him through one of the nicest neighborhoods in town. And they showed him all the big, beautiful mansions in the town. And as they were driving down through the streets and looking at those mansions, they noticed that Brother Nichols was crying. And they said, Brother Nichols, did we say something? Did we say something wrong, something that's bothered you or upset you? And he said, no. He said, I was just thinking about how hard it would be to convince the people that live in this neighborhood that they need to come to the gospel meeting and obey God and be Christians, because they don't seem to need anything, but they need God as much as anybody else does. How true that is. Jesus says, hard for a rich man to go to heaven, but with God, all things are possible. You know, in my life and your life, I'm going to face some pretty impossible situations. You may say, you know, I'm this age and I haven't met anybody to marry yet. You know, I'm married and we're this age and we haven't had any children yet. This is not going to happen. This is impossible. It's impossible for me to find somebody and meet somebody and marry somebody. It's impossible for us to have kids. It's just not going to happen. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but I know that all things are possible with God. And I know that if you have faith and you pray and you commit yourself to God, God's going to do what is best. God's going to take care of things. He always has. He always will. Think about the other situations we talked about. You know, there are going to be some decisions we're going to have to make that seem impossible from a human standpoint, but if we do what God tells us to do, God will work it out. God will bring it to pass. He's going to keep His word. He doesn't lie. Not one word of His promise ever fails. 1 Kings 8:56, He's going to keep it. He's going to keep His word. Maybe we're living in a world and we say, you know, it's impossible for me to save my children in this world that's so corrupt and so evil. Well, Noah saved his. Amram and Jochebed somehow saved Moses. You can do that with your children as well. You say, well, you know, I got this wall in front of me. God's knocked down walls before. I got this giant who's mocking me and standing in front of me and everybody else is afraid of him. God's brought down giants before. He can do it again. Well, I'm just surrounded. You know, I got this blocking my way in front of me and I got this behind me. I got nowhere to move, nowhere to go. God's made a path through the sea before. God sent the enemy home with his tail between his legs before. God can do that again. With God, all things are possible. There's just... I can't walk on water. Peter did. You know, Peter's my favorite disciple. You know why he's my favorite disciple? Not because he preached the first gospel sermon on Pentecost. Not because he made the great confession in Matthew 16. Not because he was one of the inner three. Not because of any of those things. He's my favorite because he sang. He's my favorite because he often put his foot in his mouth. He's my favorite because I can relate to him better than I can relate to anybody else. Because he seems so human. I won't deny you, but then he is denying. And he walked on water. With God, all things are possible. I don't know what you're facing. I don't know what obstacles are in your way. But I know who is above you, watching over you, who is above you, listening to your prayers, who is above you, waiting, willing and ready to give you what you need, to do what needs to be done. Do you have the faith? Will you ask? Will you sacrifice? Will you do the things necessary to enjoy the benefits of a God like that? Thank you so much for your attention this morning.